Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. This will actually be the last video that we handle in Unit 8 as far as ecology goes, and we will jump back into Unit 1 after our unit exam. And I know that we're doing things a little bit out of order in terms of the AP curriculum, but this does follow along with the textbook's ordering in terms of these topics. And so today what we are going to focus on is Unit 8's Topic 2 on energy flow through ecosystems. This video is going to correlate with Chapter 42 in the Biology in Focus textbook, and hopefully a lot of what we're going to cover in this piece is going to feel like some review from previous classes. And without further ado, if you guys are ready, let's go ahead and jump into it. So starting off, up until this point, we have been dealing with the population level when we discussed population dynamics, and at the community level when we discussed species interactions. And so now we're finally looking at the big picture. We're looking at the ecosystem. So the ecosystem takes communities and it adds in all of those lovely abiotic factors that are present in their environment. So we're dealing with things like the amount of sunlight, the temperature, the precipitation levels, whether or not water is available, and what kind of water is available. Now, all of these components working together within this ecosystem are going to interact with the communities that live there. And so if we disrupt, which we looked at disruption in terms of just general disruption to our communities in the previous video, but if we disrupt one of these abiotic factors, we can essentially change the dynamics within this ecosystem, and that can have a wide swath of effects looking at the communities that live there overall. So a little bit of a segue before we get into really the meat and potatoes of today's information. And we're going to hit thermodynamics again in the future when we talk not only about the interactions going on in the cell, but when we cover enzymes later on in Unit 3, we'll hit on thermodynamics again. But in case you have forgotten what the laws of thermodynamics are from previous classes, we have two laws that govern how energy is transferred from one system to another. So the first law of thermodynamics essentially states that the energy in the universe is constant. So all of the energy that exists continues to exist. We won't get into Einstein's theory of general relativity in here. So energy itself can be transferred. We can go from one form to another. So we can take something like chemical energy in our food, and we can transform it into kinetic energy, so movement. We can take the energy that we get and we can use it to do things. But that energy cannot be created or destroyed. Instead, it may be lost as less usable forms like heat, so thermal energy, which leads us into the second law of thermodynamics. And that states that with every time that we undergo one of these energy transformations, anytime that we take energy from one form to another, we increase the amount of entropy, a measure of disorder that we have in the universe. So we can utilize the energy that we consume as food, and we can use it to do things, but we're going to lose a good deal of that energy in the process, and that is going to increase the disorder in the system. So I want you to keep these laws of thermodynamics in mind as we look not only at general food chains and food webs, but as we look at overall the energy production within an ecosystem. Now, energy is going to be this overarching topic that is going to come up again and again, because without energy, organisms would not be able to survive. Without energy, we can't do what we need to do. So energy is one of these required pieces. One of the characteristics of life is metabolism, the sum of all of the chemical reactions happening in bodies. And the energy that is involved in metabolic reactions. Goodness, I can't talk this morning. Sorry, guys. This is important in order for us to do all the other things that allow organisms to be classified as living and to survive in their environments. So being able to reproduce, pass on our genetics, to be able to grow and develop, to be able to maintain our constant states with homeostasis. Energy is the driving force for all of these things. And organisms, living things, acquire energy as resources, whether that be a food source, getting nutrients, or plants as photoautotrophs, taking in light, absorbing light, and using that to create those organic molecules as the products of photosynthesis. And we can't forget about our chemoautotrophs in this either. So we can sometimes, in cases where organisms are capable of doing so, take inorganic sources and create organic resources. So when we look at taking in energy, we distribute these resources according to what we call the principle of allocation. And so if you think about, you have a number of boxes, and each of these boxes has different requirements. And we take little bits of energy and we put them into each of these boxes. We can only use the energy once. And so depending on how much energy is available, we can allocate different amounts to different requirements. And once we're out of energy, we do not have anything left to give to those requirements. So if energy is scarce, we may utilize more of that energy into our maintenance field, our homeostasis, just staying alive. We may not be able to reproduce at that time, or we may not be able to really acquire some of those defensive characteristics. A lot of this we can pull back to the rise of invasive species. So invasive species are able to acquire a large swath of resources from their environment because they have no natural predators. And therefore, they're able to really develop some of these categories a little bit better than we would see in our natural or native species. I already hit on the definition of metabolism. I always skip ahead of myself, but when we look at metabolism, you may think of metabolism as, oh, I've got a high metabolism. I'm able to eat a whole lot of food and still stay pretty fit or trim. And in biology, we use metabolism as really a reference of all of the different reactions that are happening in our bodies. So taking these molecules and converting them to different molecules through chemical reactions. These are all surrounded in metabolism. We're going to cover metabolism in all of its glory later on this year. So we're going to hit all of those different chemical reactions that happen, and that'll come up in Unit 3 as well. But when we look at metabolic rate, that is the total amount of energy that an organism uses per unit of time, and we measure that in calories, heat loss, oxygen consumption. We can choose a whole bunch of different dependent factors. But what we see when we compare organisms is that the larger you get, the slower or lower your metabolic rate is. And that is partially due to that resource allocation, that we need to kind of slow down how much we're using in order to maintain this larger size. And so this amount of energy that we're getting at each of these different levels is going to come into play when we look at our food chains. And when we talk about homeostasis, one of those maintenance categories for where we allocate our resources, Different organisms will maintain homeostasis in different ways. We are endothermic. So we take energy and we use it to keep that constant internal temperature. So endotherms are able to take energy and maintain their own body temperature. And if you look at something like an ectotherm, so these include fishes, reptiles, these are all organisms that don't allocate energy as heat in order to maintain their personal body temperature. And instead, they rely on the temperature in the environment. And so these cases where we're dealing with organisms that really require the ecosystem to be the source of maintenance for temperature are really at odds with changes in their environment, and they may be affected more greatly when we see changes overall. So let's meet energy at its source. Everything living on Earth, the source of their energy is the sun. The sun is creating thermal energy and light energy coming from those nuclear reactions happening in the core, and it's traveling all the way here, and it is entering the Earth system. So in this Earth system, we have a flow of energy from our producers that are able to take in that solar energy and create sugars to our consumers that consume our producers. And we essentially require this continuous input of energy in order to maintain the flow within the ecosystem. If we lose energy, we cannot survive. So coming back to that resource allocation, if we don't have enough energy to put into each of these boxes to keep ourselves alive, we will die. And as dark as that sounds, this really comes back to the idea that maintaining the order and stability of our ecosystems is extremely important. Now, if we have extra energy, if we have a gain of energy, we can add more to each of those boxes. We can grow a little bit bigger. We can maintain at a better rate. We can reproduce more plentifully. And so the amount of energy that we have present really is the driving force, what controls how well our ecosystem is able to sustain itself. Let's talk a little bit about primary production. Like I said, the source of all energy in the ecosystem is the sun. And the first organisms that are able to really take on that energy are our primary producers. So this is energy that's converted from light, solar energy, and we'll talk about this process later on, but we convert it to chemical energy in the form of sugars as a result of photosynthesis. And this is something that we can break down based on how much of that energy actually gets used. So if we look at gross primary production, and we're going to use the terms gross and net, very similar to how you might encounter them on a paycheck. Your gross pay is everything. And your net pay is when we start taking out all those taxes and fees and donations to social services. And so that's really what you have to come home with is your net. So gross is the sum. It's all the production that we're able to do. It's all the energy that we're able to use. And net is what ends up being available for further links up our food chain. So this is all of the energy that we're able to produce minus everything that we use, everything that gets taken out bit by bit. And we store that as biomass. So we're essentially able to keep that in our systems, and we're able to use it later on. So let's give you guys a critical thinking question. And just with your general knowledge of the curvature of the Earth and how light hits the Earth in all sorts of different ways depending on where we are located, we can see that the net primary production differs based on location along the globe. So satellite images show us that different ecosystems have varying levels of net primary production. So I want you to identify what areas in this graph or figure have higher levels of net primary production, and why do you think that is? Why do you think that we're able to produce more energy in certain areas of the globe compared to others? And we might consider, taking it a step further, what impact does this have on ecosystems? So I will have you guys record your answer on your page, and we'll be back in a moment. Now taking it back to some middle school level life science. We as ecologists, specialty biologists, we can group our species into what we call trophic levels. That prefix troph meaning nutrition. So these are feeding relationships. How does this organism get the energy that it needs to survive? And we start with our primary producers. These are organisms that are able to build organic molecules from inorganic sources. We're able to take chemical energy or light energy, and we're able to transform it into those organic molecules that we can store to help with our biomass. And what eats the primary producers are our primary consumers, our herbivores. And they take in the energy available in our producers and they store it in their biomass, losing a little bit as heat. And then our secondary consumers eat our primary consumers. These are our carnivores, first level carnivores. And they are able to take the energy in those primary consumers, put it into their biomass, lose a little bit as heat. And if we have tertiary or quaternary consumers, these again eat the previous level, take the energy, put it into their biomass, lose some as heat. You'll notice that the arrows on a food chain are going in the direction of the energy. So our energy from our producers go to our consumers, which go into our primary consumers, which go into our secondary consumers. And we are limited in the length of our food chain by the amount of energy that we have available in our ecosystem. I've mentioned these terms a couple of different times, but I just want to highlight that our primary producers are autotrophs. So auto meaning self, troph meaning nutrition. They're able to make their own nutrients, take inorganic energy sources, and use it to create chemical organic energy sources. So photo meaning light, chemo meaning chemical. These are terms that are going to define what sources they are using to create their own nutrition. So those scientific root words coming into play here, very important to help you understand some words that may pop up later on. We talked a little bit about heterotrophs previously, but these are organisms that cannot create their own energy sources and thus have to eat other things in order to acquire energy. Hetero means different, so they have to acquire their nutrition from different sources. They cannot make it themselves. And a little subset of our heterotrophs are detritivores. Detritivores are our decomposers. These are organisms that take detritus, non-living organic material. They break it down and they use that as their energy source. So these are things that consume things that are no longer living, whether they consume dead heterotrophs or dead autotrophs. They are a key player in our ecosystem, and oftentimes they get left off when we think about food chains and food webs, but nonetheless, very important. So the trophic structures of our community again, are determined by our feeding relationships. The arrows showing us the direction of our energy as it travels through the ecosystem. When we consider a food chain, we're linking our trophic levels in a line. We're taking producers to whatever level of consumers we end with, whether it be tertiary or quaternary. And the food web takes the idea of a food chain and expands on it. So we consider everything that is happening within an ecosystem related to the energy being transferred and all of our feeding relationships. So we can take multiple food chains and we can combine them together and see how things are interacting at this ecosystem level. I've mentioned arrows before, but I will highlight it once again. You might notice that it's important what I mentioned a couple of different times. But again, our arrows are showing the direction of energy transfer, pointing from our species that are being eaten to those species that consume those organisms. I've mentioned, and since we hit on the laws of thermodynamics there at the beginning, that there is a level of entropy that comes along with each of these energy transfers. So every time that we consume something, we are losing some amount of energy to non-usable sources, and we are increasing the disorder in our system. And so when we look at the efficiency of our ecosystem, we find that only about 10%, now this is an average, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but the key here is that we lose a great deal of the energy involved in our trophic interactions to heat, to unusable sources. So we can have this large pool of energy when we start, but as we move up the food chain, or our biomass pyramid in this case, we see that we lose heat. Now this comes into play anytime that we have a disruption. If we disrupt this system, we are going to see effects at all other levels. So what you saw in the previous is an example of a biomass pyramid. Sometimes it looks like a pyramid, sometimes it doesn't look like a pyramid, but the biomass pyramid is designed to show the amount, or the biomass, okay? Bio meaning living, mass referred to mass that exists at each of these different levels. And what you can see is that in most ecosystems, our biomass pyramid has a very wide base. We have a lot of producers. They're able to get most of the energy. But as this energy dissipates, going later and later in our food chain, the biomass decreases significantly, as you can see here in the figure. So we can only sustain the amount of consumers that we have energy available in our previous level of the trophic interactions. And so if we increase our food chain, we get less and less mass that's able to be sustained by the previous level. Another reason why we have a limit to the length of our food chain. You'll notice here that some of our aquatic ecosystems have slightly inverted biomass pyramids. Now, they're not truly inverted, but when we look at them overall, it does seem that way. But you'll notice that we leave a very important piece off of this system, and that is our detritivores, our decomposers, those working behind the scenes. And so there are lots of different things that are at play here that may or may not show up on a particular model, and this just happens to be one of those examples. The last thing that I'm going to include today are not energy related, it's matter related. So you hopefully remember from chemistry that very similar to energy, we cannot create or destroy matter. It exists in our universe, and we just take bits and pieces and we use it to build different things. So what you can kind of think of this as is if you get a set of Legos, and with that set of Legos you build a boat. I don't know why it's a boat today, but it's a boat. It's a huge boat that has all of these different little pieces, all of these elements interacting and forming chemical bonds to create this structure. And one day you decide, well, I want to build something different. So we break down this boat and we use it to build other things. Maybe we build a little castle or a house or a car. But we're taking these bits and pieces and we're using it to create something different. We are undergoing a chemical reaction to break down those structures and use the pieces. We're not throwing the pieces out. You know, the pieces are still there, but we're using them to create something different. And so when we look at the elements that are really important to sustaining living things, to create these organic molecules that we are going to highlight in the next unit with our chemistry of life topic, we have to get these from somewhere. So we take what we consume and we break it down, and it can be used to then build something new. So we're going to look at a couple of nutrient cycles, and you will find that while I'm highlighting these nutrient cycles today, they will come back into play when we talk in the next unit. But we're taking these nutrients and we're using them to build new things from their previous form. And they're going through quite a few different structures in their journey. So these are our biogeochemical cycles. Bio meaning living, geo meaning earth, chemical, of course, chemical. So we see the interactions of all three of these spheres of life on Earth to get these nutrients from one place to another. So we'll start off with the basic, the water cycle. I'm not going to get into all of the details that go into each of these different biogeochemical cycles, but we are going to highlight the ones that are important. So the water cycle, something that you may or may not have covered in as far back as elementary school. So we know that water enters Earth as precipitation and evaporates from the land and goes up into clouds where it condenses and then falls back into Earth again as precipitation. As you can see from our figure here, there's a lot more going on. You can see that we have a couple of different stores of water on Earth, and water is one of those things that is essential. Life as we know it would not exist without water. And that is because organisms use water in order to move more easily. Okay, so if we're talking early life forms, they needed to be able to get around. We don't have to expend much energy if we can just float in the water. It is often used to carry different messages and chemicals along the way. And so we'll highlight the properties of water that make it super important in the next topic in our Unit 1. But yeah. Secondary to the water cycle, probably the second most important cycle that we have here on Earth is the carbon cycle. All organic molecules contain carbon, and we're going to look at those specific organic molecules in the next unit, but know that our photosynthesizers, our chemosynthesizers, they're using the organic molecules available within their environments to build these sugars and proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, and that is going to kind of process through the ecosystem, partially through feeding relationships because we are eating but also through all the different ways that carbon can travel. And once again, we don't need to memorize the process of these cycles, but we should understand that we are taking things from one form to another. We're breaking things down and we're using it to build something different. And it is cycling. So we start with one thing and we can end with that same thing. We never lose it, not truly. Another important nitrogen cycle, specifically because some of our biomolecules, they are going to require nitrogen for their structure. I'll highlight here nucleic acids and proteins, both of which require nitrogen. And nitrogen's a little bit unique because a lot of organisms can't obtain nitrogen from inorganic sources naturally. So we really utilize some bacteria and decomposers to break down these structures and turn this into a form that we can use. So you see here again, we have a cycle. We're taking things from one form. We may end up as that same form at the end, but it's going through a couple of different, a series of changes as we go. And lastly, the phosphorus cycle, one that we don't get as much information on probably in just general biology classes, but because phosphorus as an element is also important in the structure of a bunch of our different biological molecules, namely nucleic acids, we have the phosphate group, and some lipids are phospholipids, which are required for our cell membranes, require phosphorus as an element. It too must cycle through the ecosystem. So here you can see a couple of different ways that we cycle. Again, we're going from one form to another. We may store for a little while within the ecosystem, but overall, we are seeing the cyclical nature of matter. We are transferring from one form to another, never created or destroyed. And with that, this is where we will end Unit 8, and specifically topic 8.2. Now, I hope that you guys have felt like these lectures have been rather informative and helped with some of the general instruction that we encounter here in AP Biology. And we'll be ready for our first exam here in the next week. So on that note, I will let you all go. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.